Welcome to Art and Scroll Studio. I'm Shelley Werner and the host of our Zoominar series, where we feature the makers and creators of Judaica art. On May 19, 2021, we had a special episode entitled Threads of Torah, Woven Words and Wisdom. We featured embroidery artist Rachel Braun, along with Rabbi Mark Glickman from Temple B'nai Tikvah in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. So let's get started, and let me ask you some questions that I think are important for people to know in terms of background. I want to tell them a little bit about you first, though, that Rachel graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a BA in math and an MA in science, as well as statistics. She has participated in numerous exhibitions, and her work is held in both public and private collections. She is the author of Embroidery and Sacred Text. She has been interviewed by numerous publications and spoken at many venues, including the Textile Museum at George Washington University. She is mentioned in the Guinness Book of World Records for the world's largest collection of graph paper. She lives in Silver Spring, Maryland. I know that that's an intriguing piece of information for many people. So why don't we start off, before I take you back to when you were a little girl wanting to be an artist or not, talk to me for a moment about why graph paper is so fascinating to you.
So graph paper consists of patterns that are really very beautiful. And it's not just the squared graph paper that most people are familiar with from school, but there are other kinds of grids that appear on scientific graph paper: logarithmic, isometric, hyperbolic, etc. And just like an art canvas, each one of them represents a space that is waiting to be filled. And with graph paper, in a very directed way, it describes a pattern. And with a piece of embroidery, a piece of cloth, especially with the kind of embroidery I do on even weave, there is a surface that suggests what can come out as an expression of that surface, a little more free form than graph paper, but embedded in both is just a beautiful pattern that tries to describe something about the surface of the world for you to play on.
We'll get a bit more into that as we get into the program, because we're going to show some of your samples. But tell us, when you were a young woman, did you know that you were going to be attracted to this mathematical way of art expression? Did you always want to be an artist when you were a child?
Oh, no. I didn't think of myself as an artist for quite some time, and until I picked up needle and thread in my 40s and made some mistakes. I think when I was a kid, I wanted to be an archaeologist. Later I thought about history and economics. But math is always an enduring love, and math was always like an intellectual playground. I wasn't even thinking math career. I just kept thinking, oh, you just take math. It's beautiful. So I guess in that sense, I always had a sense that beauty was around me.
So you had this desire to somehow fulfill an artistic direction, but you didn't know it. It was in a way something that was innate. But what role did Jewish camps play in your life when you went to and enjoyed Hebrew camps?
Yeah, well, first of all, like almost everyone I think who goes to a Jewish camp, it's life altering. It puts you in touch with Jewish practice 24/7 in an immersive environment with your peers, which is different from family. So it's filled with all these positive feelings for whatever you do. It was at camp that I really got into crafts, because a lot of summer camps, you do crafts, jewelry making, mosaic, macrame, and they are in a Jewish context. They're not, sometimes it's more crafts than art, but it does give you that big satisfaction of moving your fingers and creating something tangible and connecting it to something Jewish. So I think that was a big impact of camp.
We're about to have a look at some of the work, but I want to ask you, just for fun, because as we're looking at the work, people may have this question, so I'm going to anticipate it. How long does it typically take you to make one of your works? And I'm thinking of the bigger pieces, say.
The bigger pieces. So I design the pieces that you'll see on graph paper. And the work of designing takes, depending on the size, but for these very big pieces, it takes 4 or 5 days of great intention and kavanah for 5 hours a day. And my head is very much in that space of designing, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of room for other thoughts or feelings. And then after that, oh gosh, it's about 45 minutes to stitch a square inch, I once calculated. I once tried to tally it up, but it was no fun embroidering if I had a timer going, kind of thing. I would guess for one of my large pieces, 200 hours of stitching after that. So it is a huge commitment of time to make one canvas.
What camp did you attend, out of curiosity?
I attended Camp Ramah in New York State. And as an adult, I worked at Camp Ramah in Massachusetts in the United States. And those two camps are longtime rivals. So, you know, a little split allegiance there. And Camp Ramah is part of the conservative movement. It is the camps of the conservative movement.
There or mostly a camper?
So as a child, it was strictly as a camper. And as an adult, it was as a camp mom and Judaics instructor.
Awesome. So what I want to do is start to delve into the work. And before I do, I want to say that getting to know Rachel, when I look at her work, 2 words come to mind: purpose and precision. Everything that she does is meant to express an idea. There's nothing random. Everything is held in a beautiful tension. And I find that it's so mesmerizing, so that when we look at the work, not only notice what's there, notice what's not there. And in a way, that in a sense is black work, is it not? Because it's using the canvas to also tell a story. Am I right about that?
Yes, the canvas is a negative space for the stitches. That's right. It's not like cross stitch where you try to cover the canvas and sort of pixelate the image across it. It's a play with the surface.
So you're actually operating on 3 levels. You have your inspiration from the Torah that we're going to hear all about. You also have the color and the materials that are going to show, and you have the background that is going to become the negative space. So really, you're playing 3 instruments there. So
okay,
let's get started and have a look. So you can see, here we go. So this is our first image, and it's a different types of graph paper. Rachel, tell me a bit about what does this mean, all these different types of sizes and scales?
So the ones over on the left, like the second and third ones are semi-logarithmic paper. And you can see the second and third one, I'm sorry, from the bottom, because I can see your pointer. Yeah. So the pattern, especially in that first one, which is, I think, logarithmic paper, it's not an even weave. There's some pulsating action as the grids move across the page. And the second and third one, which I started pointing out, are the type of papers you sketch epidemic curves on. You know, the exponential curve that is characteristic of the spread of disease. And you can feel the pulsating of this terrible thing through the paper. That's sort of the natural world of disease there. If you go about 4 up, you have your standard square grid. It's the one that's very airy and open, even squares. And that's the kind you learn in algebra: over 2, up 1, over 2, up 1. I need grids like that because in some of my work, I'm actually pulling in trigonometric ratios and thinking about that idea of rise and run.
Because I know you've told me in a beautiful way, you've set it up and you've said that on a graph, you can capture the world in a way. It's like a snapshot.
Yeah, that's a beautiful. These surfaces are different effects in the world. Yeah.
So in effect, so let's go and have a look at a piece that is, I think, something that is of a heritage nature for you, and tell us a bit about your history.
This is an early piece, and it was about the third one I did, but it was very important in a transitional way. So this was, I made for my third child, Hanan, for the occasion of his bar mitzvah, and I had made two before for the older kids. And for this one, I used the quote. I always start with a line of sacred text. And I use the quote that we say in Shema, they shall make themselves tzitzit on the corners of their garments throughout their generations. And so this is a mini talit. The piece itself is, it's probably about 5-6 inches high and 13 or 12 or 13 inches across. But if you look in the corners, you see these 4 medallions. They are crocheted medallions. They came from a medallion doily that Hanan's great-grandmother, for whom he's named, her name was Hannah Bronstein, Zichronah Livracha, and she had created this doily, and I very carefully cut apart the little medallions, put them in the corners, like where you put, the corners of a talit. And as I did that, it struck me, I'm actually living out this verse. This verse says that the heritage of mitzvot is going to pass lidorotam throughout their generations. And I was literally doing that with my hands. And that really moved me in the direction of thinking that the act of embroidery was an act of living out Jewish life and an act of enacting Jewish text. So I didn't just feel like an artist. In fact, I possibly didn't even think of myself as an artist yet, even though I'd been designing it, because they were, modest early designs. But it made me feel like I was a Jewish artist then, that I had come up with another way to experience or to express parshanut, an interpretation of sacred text, with my own hands.
So we're going to go from a piece that is very small to a piece that is breathtaking in its detail and its expansiveness. And I believe that this is entitled 48 Ways.
48 Ways.
And before I get you to talk about your intent and the spiritual elements and what drew you to this, I'm going to invite Rabbi Mark Glickman to join us. I hope that he does, and that he's he's secretly here. There he is. Rabbi Glickman, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here, and it's great to be with Rachel and with you and with everybody else who's on this evening.
I'm going to tell people who may not know that Rabbi Mark Glickman is the spiritual leader of Temple B'nai Tikvah here in Calgary. Born in Cincinnati, Ohio, raised in suburban Chicago, Rabbi Glickman graduated from Washington University and received his rabbinical ordination from Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. His first book, Sacred Treasure, The Cairo Geniza, was published in 2011. His second book, Stolen Words, The Nazi Plunder of Jewish Books, was released in 2016. Rabbi Glickman, how wonderful to have your commentary to accompany Rachel's thoughts. So I'm going to get Rachel to go back to her thought starters on how she came to develop this piece.
So this is a quote from Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, chapter 6, verse 6. And it says, there are 48 ways to acquire Torah. And you're expecting a list of, real nerdy behaviors, making flashcards, but instead the 48 ways have tremendous humanity. There's things like with awe, with humility, by being beloved, by loving others, by showing respect and attending to sages. It describes a beautiful life and being a beautiful person as a prerequisite for being able to pull Torah into. So I was attracted to this because it had a number in it, 48, yay! And my interpretation was that each of the 48 ways, which are there in the Torah scrolls where you see the Hebrew script, there are 48 of those.
So
and
there's 48 different patterns happening here?
Yes. Each of the 48 ways that are listed in the Mishnah are embedded in a distinct black work embroidery pattern. And that is one of the ways that I'm trying to interpret this. I'm really trying to focus on the wisdom of the text that says that there are many different ways for human beings to come to Torah. And so by giving each one a distinct pattern, I'm trying to emphasize that idea. It appeals to me as a teacher because, we know that there are many, many approaches people bring to learning. And it appeals to me, well, as a teacher and Jewishly, to think that each of these 48 attributes, which are present in varying degrees in Jews who are approaching Torah, that all of us belong, and that all of these patterns together fit well, and they make an entire Torah scroll. So it doesn't.
Yes. Sorry, I'm going to point out to people before I turn to Rabbi Glickman that when I mentioned that the spaces between in terms of design, so what Rachel's doing here is that you can see it's not all filled in like a traditional embroidery would be. She's using the spaces between as design elements. And so Rabbi Glickman, what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask you what some of your thoughts are on what Rachel had to say. And while you speak, I'm going to go to some details so people can see in more detail these stitches. What are some of your thoughts?
Well, of course, first of all, I just stand in awe of 48 different types of stitchery that makes this. I would think I would be hard pressed to do even one, and that you have 48 so beautifully rendered ones. I just stand in awe of that. And I think I would just, in a very, very picky way, have a qualm with just one tiny little thing that Rachel said, and that is that these 48 ways are prerequisites of learning Torah, because the passage that she so insightfully focused on says that the Torah is given in 48 ways. So it's not that these are prerequisites for getting Torah, it's that these really are Torah, that we learn Torah by adopting all of these different human characteristics. And that's why I think it was so brilliant that the way she rendered this. If we were to look at the original slide, we would see that it's not that these 48 traits are sitting next to the Torah or a pathway to Torah, but they are the Torah itself. And that's one of the great insights that I get from this piece. So I just want to thank you, Rachel. This is spectacular.
It is stunning. Here's another detail off of it, and you can see it's profound, Rachel, because even if you don't understand intellectually, you can spiritually get a read on it, which I think is the ultimate goal of art. So tell us now about Karev Yom, because I know that you are a person who can do fonts in embroidery, which is not an easy thing to do. What inspired you to take on this phrase?
Well, at first I was attracted to it musically. The Karev Yom is a song associated with Passover. Some families sing it at the first night. Karev, Karev, Karev Yom, Asher Hulo Yom, or maybe you might know the tune, Karev Yom, Karev Yom. And it's a phrase that refers to intimacy between God and the Jewish people, because it's the phrase means draw near a day that is neither day nor night. And it's part of a piyut written in the 7th century by Yanai. A piyut is a liturgical poem that recounts the long list of encounters where God has saved the Jewish people at midnight, which of course includes the Exodus from Egypt, which is why it's associated with Passover. I wanted to think about this fluidity of a day that's neither day nor night, that, the notion that God would be with us always, it wouldn't stop at midnight. I did that with the colors. And I also wanted to experience that feeling in that pasuk, that verse in this font, which I call my Star Wars font. In the Star Wars movie where the letters are big and then they sort of float away. And so the letters I have sketched here are just a little bit tipped. The bottoms are a little bit wider on some of the letters, like on the vet on the first line. And I hope they convey a message of kind of, big chunky letters moving back. And that's part of the eerie feeling of encountering God at midnight. On the left is the graph paper sketch that I did prior to putting it onto cloth. So the cloth itself is not marked. I hold the paper nearby as I'm working on the cloth. eventually the pattern just floats into your fingers. So you just keep stitching without necessarily having to refer back to the design on the paper.
So when I get Rabbi Glickman to comment on Karev Yom, draw near to a day, and you can see here in the stitching, it seems to come close and go farther away. You know, that's in your color choices here. But I'm gonna, while he gives us his thoughts, I'm gonna show some of your other fonts and other type of styles that you have developed. What's your thought on Karev Yom, Rabbi Glickman?
Well, I will say that piyut is a form of liturgical poetry that really, in some ways, gets kind of short shrift in Reform Judaism, and it's really unfortunate. Somebody who writes a piyut was called a paitan, and the paitan named Yanai, who composed this verse. If you look at the Jewish encyclopedia that came out just around the turn of the last century, there's a very brief article about Yanai saying that he was evidently a very prolific poet, but we only have a few very short and fragmentary scraps of his poetry. But then what happened is that scholars continued to unpack the contents of this discovery that they had made in 1897 called the, or 1896, 1897, called the Cairo Geniza, this attic chamber in Egypt where they discovered upwards of 300,000 ancient and medieval documents, including several hundred poems of Yanai, so that they used to do a triennial Torah cycle where they would go through the whole Torah in 3 years. He wrote a poem for each of the 150 plus Torah portions in that triennial cycle. So Yanai is in some ways a very newly discovered poet, even though he was from, you said the 7th century, Rachel?
I think so. Does that sound right to you?
That sounds right to me.
Yeah.
My other comment will be a personal one. This poem, although Reform Judaism has given short shrift to piyut, this poem was in the Union Haggadah, edited in 1923 by the organization then called the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, now the Union for Reform Judaism. And it was the Haggadah that my grandparents had and that we used at Passover Seders when I was growing up. And actually it's still in a lot of Haggadot, including those by the Reform movement. And whenever we used to get to this, we called it the spooky voice contest. We would have a spooky voice contest, and everybody would read a stanza, and the person who read it in the spookiest voice, in English, of course, would win. Well, they wouldn't win a prize, but they'd get kudos. And I remember it sounded spooky. Unto God let praise be wrought at the solemn hour of midnight. And I've still, at least until recently, have done this in my Seders, and my kids have learned that it's time to roll their eyes at me when we get to this. But what Rachel's rendition of this beautiful poem showed me is that this doesn't have to be spooky, that we can look to a day that's neither day nor night, a day in which God will be with us always. That's a great messianic hope. And I learned that by looking at this this embroidery that this embroidery that Rachel did, and it just reminds me of what an educational experience looking at and encountering art can be. And so I'm grateful to you, Rachel, for really opening up new dimensions to me of this poem I've been reciting ever since I can remember.
Well, I want to move now to something that also I know has had us reconsidering and thinking out, what does this really mean, Bamidbar, in the desert? And I'm going to stay on the embroidery a little bit longer because I feel I might have gone a bit quick back there. Rachel, why Bamidbar? Why did you choose to illustrate this? What was the salient point?
So Bamidbar is also what we call the Book of Numbers. And in Numbers chapter 33, there is a list of the stops of the Israelites leaving Ramses and headed through the wilderness of sin until they get to just the edge of the promised land. And so you see that on the border of the piece. If you start in the upper right corner, it says Ramses, then goes Sukkot, Etam, Piachirot, all those stops, roll around counterclockwise, and then the last word is Yericho, Jericho. So I love that part of Numbers chapter 33 because it's so repetitive. And they left Ramses and they encamped at Sukkot, and they left Sukkot and they encamped at Etam, and they left Etam and they encamped at Piachirot, etc. And the repetition of the Torah, it always makes me think of Gertrude Stein's comment, repetition is insistence. And it feels like a very Jewish thing to repeat things, we're going back and we're going to read this all over again. So I love the rhythm of that. It felt very Jewish just to have that rhythm. And I wanted to honor that section of journeying in Numbers 33. The piece is stitched in desert tones, the sort of the gold browns of the desert, but in many different tones, because especially when you look at the Negev, you see so many different colors. You don't realize that deserts are that colorful till you're there and see it. And the different pattern blocks have different moods. Some of these are very standard black work embroidery patterns, and some I created myself on graph paper. And some of them feel frenetic, which certainly the Israelites had a lot of that. Some of them are calmer, which the Israelites had a little bit less of in the desert. So the goal was to convey the many different passions and experiences and feelings that a journey like that would take. The other piece of the design is that the piece has an essential 180-degree rotation to it.
I'm going to go to that graph that we have that illustrates that. But before I do, can you comment on the coloration? Would it be fair to say that these colors were inspired by the desert? What were you thinking?
Yeah, they definitely want to pull up that desert feeling. And the cloth I work with, the floss, the thread, DMC is the company. They make it very easy for an artist to get these colors allied, because I forget what the color number is. Let's say it's 730. So the darker brown would be 730, and then they add a little bit white to the dye lot, you get 731, and a little more white into 732. So all of these browns are in the same family. They're in one desert, but they are different shades of the desert.
So now this is the design pattern for that embroidery, correct?
Yes, I had to create this because this piece was accepted in a juried art exhibit of the American Mathematical Society. And so I had to actually give them all of the geometric symmetry codes that constitute this piece. So when you see in that lower right corner, there's a pattern that's called a P2 pattern in geometry. That means that the piece has a 180-degree rotation. So that rectangle in the lower right corner, if you put a pinwheel in the middle of it and rolled it around 180 degrees, halfway around a circle, it would fall on top of itself.
And this is what makes your work so amazing, because on the one hand, it's inspired by the spiritual element, but it's so able to be brought into a different realm, a mathematical realm. And so, Rabbi, what would be your comment about the idea of the comings and goings and the ordering of them?
So, Rachel, what was that Gertrude Stein quote that
repetition is insistence.
Repetition is insistence. And you're absolutely right that repetition is a very Jewish thing. It speaks to the notion of the importance of keva in Jewish prayer. Keva is the Hebrew word meaning fixed or set, and this is the set part of Jewish prayer. It's that dimension of Jewish prayer which tells us, say these words at that time in this way, whether you mean them or not, whether you feel them or not, whether you're in the mood to say them or not, and often out of the rhythm and out of the habit of saying these words over and over and over again, you can attain a sense of kavanah, a sense of intention, a sense of connection with God. And sometimes it might happen only one time out of 100, but that one time will make the other 99 repetitions of that quite meaningful and quite important. I love also the fact that you list all these place names. And of course, as I read these, the question that comes to mind is each of these names a destination or a departure point? And of course, in the Torah, the answer is clear, and the answer is yes.
Yes.
So often, I mean, I think there's something very insightful about that in terms of our lives, that so often we say, I'm just trying to get here, I'm just trying to get to that point, I'm just trying to achieve this or attain that. And all of a sudden we get there, we've reached our destination. And then of course we have other things we want to achieve. So that destination in turn becomes a departure point to the next stop in the journey of our lives, just as it was with the journey of our people. And of course, the final stop is Yericho, and Yericho in Hebrew is etymologically related to Yareach, which means moon. And of course, the moon is constantly journeying. It's constantly waxing and waning. It's constantly, coming and going, just like the Israelites did in each of these places.
Beautiful marriage of intent and spirituality. Thank you for talking about the repetition, because so often when we are in services, we seem to be repeating, in a way, different phrases, but the point is that the destination, the journey is the destination. Yes. So I want to take
by the way, Shelley, I'll add that as a stuttering rabbi, I am partial to repetition myself. Yes. So
and I do agree that hearing things more than once can sometimes be very beneficial.
And that's part of why embroidery feels like a very Jewish activity to me. You know, the glide of the needle in and out, just that repetition puts me in a certain space, you know, a certain zone. It's keva, it's fixed, but then I achieve the kavanah, which some of the people who are listening, who are themselves needle folk, know that feeling. So
tell us about 10 garments. What inspired you to do a piece that, in fact, references where God is wearing a garment?
So this is another piyut from also, I think, 7th century. It's by Elazar HaKalir, who was a prolific paitan. And it's read in some congregations on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. And I like the melody for it. So before I ever thought of embroidering it, it has a certain melody. In the upper right corner, it says, Melech, the king, that's God, who is clothed in 10 garments, who is surrounded by the court of holy beings, those are the angels, who is who's present in the sod of Kedoshim, in the, I only think I know, like
of holinesses.
Yes. And then there's a pause in the melody, and then in the lower left corner you see Kadosh, the Holy One. So the melody goes El Naratz B'Sod Kedoshim. Pause. Kadosh. So there's still this space, even though God is among all these holy beings. There's a moment where God is distinct and God is apart. And I wanted to convey that in the embroidery, and that's why the word kadosh is on its own, to sort of pay honor to that melody, which traditionally is one of the Misinai tunes, a tune that Moses jotted down carefully at Sinai. Yeah.
Now I have to speak to this because you've asked people a question, can you find the snail? And I'm going to show them the snail. It's over here.
Yeah.
Why is there a snail?
There's a style of piyut where the paitan's showing off a little bit how much Torah he knows. So there are 10 times in the Hebrew Bible where God is referred to as wearing a garment. And that's stuff like God is robed in heroism, God is clothed in righteousness, God dons justice, that kind of idea. And so in the piyut, HaKalir is dropping in all these 10 words, but he doesn't give footnotes with references. I mean, that might be a subject to the technology of writing of his time, but the well-educated person could read his way through the piyut and say, oh, I know which one this is talking about. So in the 2nd century in the Midrash of Breshit Rabbah, the set of Midrashim around Breshit, there's a discussion of another reference in the book of Ezekiel to a angel who is wearing a cloak. And the question is, why would an angel wear a cloak? Which is the question for us. Why would God need to appear to us in a garment? And the answer given is that just like a snail wears a garment, so does the angel wear a cloak. So when you think of a snail, you don't think of the squishy thing. You think of your mental image is the snail's cloak. So, and so too, God becomes more accessible to us if we could give God this garment. So I thought, hoo, I have one up Kalir. I found one more reference. Well, not really, because it's to an angel, not to God. So I tucked in the snail because having a conversation across many centuries is another good Jewish activity.
Well, I want to turn to Rabbi Glickman and say, what do you say about the idea of God wearing clothes? What does our tradition say?
It's very interesting. I personally draw a very different conclusion from that idea than I think Rachel did. Rachel talked about how God, the notion of God wearing clothing makes God more accessible. And I think you meant that God is in some way more imaginable, more like us in some ways, more conceivable. Is that what you meant?
Anthropomorphized in some way, yeah.
And so I can certainly see how one would think that way. However, the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of the clothed God is a God who is partly covered up. I mean, we wear clothing ourselves because we want to keep parts of ourselves private. We don't want to disclose the entirety of who we are to the entire world. And Maimonides said that we can't ever fully know what God is. We can know what God's not, but we can't really, as finite human beings, fully comprehend what God is. And that in some ways is an anti-mystical perspective, because in some ways mysticism is all about getting to know God, becoming acquainted with God, unifying with God. That's why mystical thought often takes has a certain erotic dimension, because it's about a unification of ourselves with the divine, and that's often eroticized. And here God keeps God's clothes on. The God is partly hidden, and there's something. You want to know God, you can't fully know God because God is clothed. And what is God clothed with? Well, it's all these wonderful things about God. Tzedakah, I see, which is righteousness, and hidur, glorification. I think this is geut over there, pride. The gevurah, strength. These are all good things on the one hand, and yet they are the things that keep us from knowing the real essence of what God is. I'll also say, it's interesting too, if we could go back for 1 second, please, Shelley, that there's a lot of blue in this, and in the word that the Bible uses for blue is techelet. And how did they make the dye for techelet? They made it from what was called a chilazon, which is a very rare and therefore very valuable snail, just like we see in the upper left of this.
Okay,
So,
I think that brings us full circle then, and lets us come to this piece, which is based on the concept of Jacob's ladder. Rachel, what was your inspiration? I can see the ladder going up to heaven. Why did you choose this passage?
So this is an example of using embroidery as parshanut, as expounding on a Jewish text, because in the passage where I have some quotes in red in the embroidery, or in a reddish orange, there seems to be a mistake. It says the ladder was set in the ground and the angels were going up and down. And that feels like it's backwards. Wouldn't angels go down and then up? So one rabbinic interpretation is, well, the angels were clearly already with Yaakov, with Jacob, on his way from Haran. And so they had to go up because they were there on the ground with him. But I ran into a commentary by the Hasidic master, the first Chabad rabbi, Schneur Zalman, who said that the twist in the words is simply there to focus our attention on the act of moving along rungs of a ladder. It draws our attention to movement on the ladder. And Reb Zalman's point of view was that every step of a spiritual journey is valuable, needed, distinct, stands on its own. And and I try to add in that interpretation by creating a sampler of stitches. So all up and down the ladder, you have different expressions of an artistic idea, I guess. There you have different patterns. Each one of them you have to pause at and has a different feeling, has a different intensity of blue or sometimes green, could be very geometric and concrete, could be more fanciful. And so I'm trying to present this interpretation that every step on the ladder is a different spiritual experience.
I think that comes across absolutely as you transition through the different patterns and the different colors, even the minute changes in here where you have a bit of a green and go back to the tchelet. But what I'm really intrigued at is the Lord was in this place and I did not know it. Rabbi, can you comment on that?
Well, yes. I mean, what the Hebrew literally means, if we're going to give a very syllable by syllable translation, is, behold, God was in this place, and I did not know. Vanochi lo yadati. And Rabbi Lawrence Kushner used that as a title for one of his books, I believe, and he cited a Hasidic commentary that pointed out that that really what the text was trying to say is God was in this place, and I was only able to become aware of it because it wasn't me that I was so obsessed with. I did not know. In other words, I was only able to have a transcendent experience because I wasn't being so darn self-centered like I usually am. And indeed, I think it is only possible for us to have these transcendent experiences. It is only possible for us to be truly religious when we reach beyond ourselves, when we're not so concerned with our own individual and often selfish needs all the time, but when we can reach beyond ourselves. And that's that's why that's such a meaningful phrase to me.
I think that also these different stages and different levels, in a way, are speaking to both what you said, Rachel, and what you said, Rabbi, which is that you need to encounter things that you don't necessarily know that you're going to get something out of, but you take the steps, and as you do, behold, it is revealed.
Beautiful, yes.
Now we come to the gates, and here's a set of 3. Rachel, what are these gates?
So they were stitched over a couple year period between 2004 and 2009, I think. And at the time I'm very fascinated with liturgy or text that includes the words gates, because gates are so promising. They are entries to new experiences. So on the left, you have from the Shacharit service and morning service, God opens every day the doors of the gateways of the east, and the sun bursts through the firmament, through the windows of the firmament. And so it's a celebration of creation, focusing on the sun, because it's part of the morning service where light plays a big role. And so I took the words of that prayer and used them as borders, and inside I put in these double door gates. The middle one is from a piyut that's at Yom Kippur, the last service, the Ne'ilah service. And here maybe the gates are closing, not bursting open to let the sun in. But this is from the part of the service where a beautiful song is sung that open for us the gates at the time the gate is closing, Kifan Ayom, because the day is dampening, is drawing to a close, and ask God to forgive us, to grant us life. And the third one, the gates image there, is from Psalm 122, when the pilgrims are coming to the gates of Jerusalem. And it says, Omdod hayu raglenu samchenu samachti ve'omrim li. I was so happy when I came to stand at the gates of Jerusalem. So I
Rabbi,
had 3 different gates motifs.
and I'm going to get Rabbi to talk about the middle one.
Well, I just, throughout this whole session, I find myself wanting to put my nose right up to the screen and look at all the spectacular and intricate work, but I think that would be kind of impolite in this context. But I'll say that this passage here, Patach lanu sha'ar, b'tzeit ne'ilat sha'ar, open for us the gates at the times of the locking of the gates. Again, as Rachel said, this is from the Ne'ilah, which for me is really the highlight of the Jewish liturgical year. The poetry is so beautiful and stirring. Let us, get our last bit of teshuvah, our last bit of atonement in as the gates begin to close. Grant us, inscribe us in the book of life as the gates begin to close. Do all of these things for us during the final moments. We've just had a long day of Yom Kippur. It's starting to get dark outside. And I found that you combine beautiful stirring poetry with a day's worth of protein deprivation, and it can make for an elevating religious experience. But and so I just am so touched by this visual representation of this prayer that always stirs me so profoundly, and I'm reminded of all of the different kinds of gates that we whose thresholds we cross over the course of a day, over the course of a year, over the course of a lifetime. Perhaps this is why in a piece of classical Jewish literature, a volume of Talmud or Torah, if you open the book up, the frontispiece traditionally it has an image of a gate. It's the gates of Torah through which we enter. And
Yeah, that's right.
The words of Torah. So gates, the whole notion of transitioning is so much a part of what Yom Kippur is about, and by extension, I think so much of what Jewish life is about, is of transitioning from one realm into another one in so many different ways. I think this is in so many ways, and I don't say this to oversimplify, but I say this with intending it for all of its complexity. This is so very Jewish in so many ways.
Just so brilliant, because Rachel, in the repetition of the stitchery, even a person who isn't a person who does stitching can feel the peacefulness. We can feel it. It's not jarring, it's settling, it's calming, and it's engaging. And I know we've had a comment from someone who's watching, who's also a stitcher, and says she can relate, or he can relate to this kind of feeling. So now I want to come to this beautiful showstopper piece, really, because I've looked at it for quite a long time, and I appreciate the repetition here in the stitching. And I know you were inspired very much by the direct instructions about how to design this. So what are we looking at?
So again, I was in Shul, and I saw this line in Exodus, and I was completely captivated. Kaftor tachat shnei akanim mimena, v'kaftor tachat shnei akanim mimena, and then it repeats again, v'kaftor tachat, and that's along the central stem of this lampstand. And I thought, the Torah is very terse. Why would you repeat that 3 times? And took me back to that sort of Gertrude Stein moment, repetition is insistence, and the detail work of it, and the seriousness of the purpose in creating the Mishkan, and the idea that for this particular phrase, Bitzalel in the Torah was given all these instructions to build the Mishkan, but supposedly the lampstand, which is made from a single piece of gold, maybe God actually did it. It's a mysterious moment, and there's that strong repetition that just focuses you on the detail of the reading in the Torah. It was very moving to me, and I wanted to stitch that and stitch those words. And then there's, you see, I don't often embroider with a hoop. The blue fabric and the dye made it a very stiff fabric, and the hoop was very helpful.
What I'm really looking forward to hearing is Rabbi's thoughts on the idea of place, the idea of architecture, the idea of symbolism, because obviously in the Torah it's very specific about the menorah. And here we have a bunch of images, including the Arch of Titus. Share with us your thoughts on what this has to do with creating a sacred space.
Well, I'll do that, but can I just make one other brief comment about the menorah that Rachel did? If we could go back to that, if you go into your classical Christian cathedral, you'll see all this beautiful, vivid artwork showing these stories from the Bible, pictures of people and angels and all that. And of course, if you go into a mosque, you won't see any representational art at all. Sometimes they'll take the words, the fancy Arabic script, make them arabesques, very elaborate calligraphy that becomes art. Because that's because Islam takes the prohibition against representational art very, very seriously. Judaism occupies a middle ground between those two, because we have the second commandment of the 10 Commandments, which says, do not make a graven image to worship it. So we've understood that to mean there's been a little bit of a tension in Judaism about representational art, but we've come down on the side of, yes, it's okay to make representational art, but we don't worship it. But here in this piece, we see this middle ground that Judaism occupies that Rachel created so beautifully, because here we have the representation through the patterns of the menorah, and the words themselves become the menorah that it is portraying. So we have the words and the images showing the middle ground that Judaism occupies. And to get to your question, Shelley, the menorah has for centuries been a central symbol of Judaism and the Jewish people. These days, we think of the Star of David as occupying that role, but in the total span of Jewish history, the Star of David is a relatively new symbol. There were few Stars of David that were found in the Cairo Geniza, the earliest representations of that, but really it became a symbol with the rise of Zionism in the late 19th and early 20th century. But for centuries before that, it was the menorah. So you see in the bottom right here, I believe that's the image from the Arch of Titus, showing the Roman soldiers carrying the menorah away. And this was an archway that was made in Rome to celebrate their return and the Roman victory over the Jewish people, portrayed by their capturing the menorah. In the top center there, you see the menorah that's outside the Knesset in Israel. You see it on the Israeli coin here as well. So this menorah, of course, was in the temple, and it really represented God's shining presence in and amongst our people. And it was a very religious symbol, unlike what is arguably the more secular representation of the Star of David. So this really has a way, this symbol really does have a way of making a place into a Jewish place because of the centrality of its symbolism of Judaism.
Thank you very much for that. As a designer, and I've been involved in the interior design and interior architecture of numerous places of worship, and I know that the symbolism that is utilized is very powerful, and it's important to give thought to that. And I know that, to your point, the Magen David has really become associated with Israel in a way, and whereas this you can find that goes back many years before that.
Well, yeah, I mean, through Israel, it's really come to be associated not only with Israel, but also, as a symbol of Judaism. But, for those of you who belong to Temple B'nai Tikvah, you'll know that we have two very stylized renditions of the menorah on the front wall of our sanctuary that we face while we're worshiping. And that's very common in synagogues around the world. And it's no surprise that Israel, while they put the Star of David on their flag, they put the menorah outside the Knesset.
So now I'm going to show a photo of Rachel's book, Embroidery in Sacred Text. And I know Rabbi's got the book, and I also have it. And I can tell you it's available on her website that my partner Karin is going to post in the chat, so people who are interested can get to know more of Rachel's work. The designs are beautiful, and really she has some explanation and her thought behind it. And I encourage people to get this book. It's fantastic. But I want to talk to you, Rachel. What are you doing in the wilderness, not getting eaten by a bear? What are you doing there?
Well, one great thing about this kind of artwork is that you can fold it up, stick it in your backpack, and take it anywhere, which you can't do with a big painting canvas, I suppose. So here I was hiking with my kids. They can hike a lot farther than me at this point, and so they continued up the mountain. And I said, I'm going to sit here and stitch. That's get a lot of embroidery work done. Stealing a moment here or there. Was certainly critical during my carpool years. Always have something nearby to just keep those hands busy while you're waiting. So
amazing. Yeah. And I'm going to now take us to a slide that is going to show all the amazing artists that we have had this year on Art and Scroll, except for Rachel, of course, she's going to be added on there. And I just want to remind people that they can check our YouTube channel, Art and Scroll Studio, and our Instagram, and you can see a lot of the work of the amazing artists that we've had this year. And you can check out Nina Bonus because she is now up on our channel, and she was someone that we featured earlier in the year. So now I'm going to stop the share just so it's the three of us here. I want to encourage anyone who has a question that they can text it to Karen or me. And while we're waiting for someone any questions that you might have, I'm going to ask Rachel, did you ever hurt yourself with your embroidery needle sitting there embroidering on a hiking trail?
Not on a hiking trail, but when I made that very first piece for my oldest child's bat mitzvah, I was very inexperienced, and I was working off a pattern. I hadn't yet learned how to, or taught myself how to design on graph paper, and I picked up the wrong kind of needle. I picked up a sharp, but for this kind of embroidery, you're not piercing fabric, you're using the even weave and going through the empty holes around each square, and you need a blunt needle. So I went through with my sharp, I started bleeding on the fabric and couldn't wash out the blood. And so I said, well, I guess I can fix this. So I picked up that piece of graph paper pattern I had purchased of the skyline of Jerusalem, and I rearranged the buildings so that I would cover up the blood stain. And then as I was redrawing the building, I thought, I can do this. I know how to work my way around a piece of graph paper, so that launched my design career, quite inadvertent.
Okay, and I'm going to ask you something, Rabbi. If you could have Rachel embroider something for you, what pasuk, what chapter, what would inspire you? What's Rachel's next job for you?
Well, it's no surprise, no secret that this is the second time we've done this program. And so when we first did this, what I said was Bereshit, that I would love to see a rendition of In the Beginning. And I think you said you're working on something.
I had finished one, yeah.
Oh, okay. So I would love to see that. I would also, there's so many that come to mind. I think I might also like to see, what an artist would do with God saying to Moses, nobody may see my face and live. How would an artist portray that? Portray the very essence of importrayability, if that's a word. That would be, I think that's probably a harder one to conceptualize than Bereshit, which makes me even more curious to see what you would do with it.
Well, here's a question for Rachel from someone, and maybe this will be part of the answer. One of our viewers asks, do you do any other kinds of embroidery besides black work?
I have not. The black work, I like the patterns. And I like the math that is required to get the black work to work. I've used inverse trigonometry functions to fit the different patterns into that Melech Basara Levushim, the 10 garments one, to get the rise right as I'm moving around. So black work gives you a lot of mathematical opportunities. Other ones a little less so. Counted cross stitch is more about filling the space. So I have not done too much other types of work that way.
So I have another question for you. And the questioner asks that you seem committed to a rectangular frame suggested by the graph paper. do you also or ever think in circles or swirls or in more free form shapes?
I know that people use those shapes, for example, with tamari balls. And I haven't gone that direction because I've got a backlog of ideas to stitch and design already in the medium that I feel so comfortable in. So I guess that while I still have ideas working through the black work, I guess I'm sticking with it.
Your answer could be, I'm good. You know what I'd love you to show people just for fun, and I know that we're at the end of our time, but you have the graph paper for the 48 ways, correct? Is it nearby you?
It's in the next room.
Oh, it's okay. If you have to go get it, that's all right.
Okay.
We had it nearby last time. I want to take this opportunity to thank both of you so very much. Rachel, it's always an inspiration to hear your thought process and how you make it come alive. And Rabbi, it's always an inspiration to hear how you are inspired and able to inspire me to think of new ways to approach these phrases. So thank you both so very much. And you know what, we should do this again.
Your questions, Shelley, have really helped me understand the work I'm doing, the way you have pushed me in different directions to think about the stuff I wasn't really conscious of. It's been a joy to work with both of you.
Thank you so much. But you know, that's the true sign of an artist, which is they create the work, they put it into the world, and then it stands as a place to have a dialogue. The work speaks for itself. The work leads our conversation. So thank you so much for that. Very grateful. And thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Shelley. And Rachel, it's always a joy.
It was great to talk with you this evening.